Hello again and very welcome to the chapter about making space. Sometimes it happens that when our king is under an attack, the only chance lies in providing the king with an additional square. We have to free a square for the king to which it can escape. We could do this with our pieces and we could do it with our pawns. I would like to look at both situations here in the following examples. So let's start with a rather simple example, I would say. We have a game here with the white pieces Kovacevic and playing black is Ilincic. White has just played here queen e4. We are playing with the black pieces. We can instantly see that white is threatening to give mate in 1. So what do you think? How could we possibly defend against this threat? Which would be the best way of preventing queen takes h7? Aha, not that simple, right? Because we could use the g-pawn to block the queen, but in that case we are losing the bishop because there is a pin on the a8 h1 diagonal. So this is not possible, unfortunately. And there is no other way in which we can protect the pawn on h7 or somehow obstruct white's queen along the b1 h7 diagonal. There is only one chance for us here. We have to give up that pawn and run with our king. So for that to happen, you can of course already imagine which is the piece which will have to make space for the king, right? Of course, it's the rook. So now that we know that, let's check which would be the best square for the rook. The worst square probably would be e8. As you can see, if we go this way, we are actually obstructing the king later on. It could go to this square, but it could not use the e8 square anymore. And this means that white could win by taking on h7, queen takes h7 check, and after king f8, they would of course not rush to give this check. They would first give another check, of course. They would play here bishop c5, and as you can see, next turn they will mate us. So e8 is not a good destiny for the rook. We should look for a more useful square for the rook where it doesn't obstruct the black king on its path towards the center. So of course that's easy to see. Common sense dictates that rook c8 must be the best move, because in this way we're also putting some pressure along the c file. You never know what that might be good for, but if we can choose between a more active square and a more passive square, even without knowing the exact consequences, we should of course go for the more active square, so that in this case, for example, we are tying down white's queen a little to the bishop on c2. So this happened in the game. White took on h7. They could also take first on f6. In that case, we will have to take back with a pawn, of course, because still we have this pin to think about. After d takes f6, queen takes h7, king f8, you can see that black's king will have a very safe destiny on e7, so this is not really something to worry about with the black pieces. After rook c8, in the game, Kovacevic instead took immediately on h7, and after king f8, you can see that already black can take a sigh of relief. Their king is in fact rather safe now. It's nice, of course, also with the rook on c8 that white cannot give this check on c5 anymore. So white played at this point bishop takes f6. The check on h8 is also not very useful because we would simply bring up the king to e7. They played in the game bishop takes f6, and after knight takes f6, yeah, this time black is happy to take with the knight instead, so that the queen is becoming more active, and also you can see that the knight will have some future destinies also on the light squares, depending on white's play. At this point, white brought back the queen to d3, perhaps in time travel also, but it was not completely clear how they could improve their position. Black played simply queen c7. So this position is rather equal, I would think. Black has no particular problems. What happened here is that white made a huge blunder. They have to secure this bishop in some way. The best way would have been rook d2, which has the, you could say, prophylactic point that if black plays knight c4 trying to mate white at this point, then white could just play g3, and the rook is defending also against the fork on f2. However, in the game, Kovacevic had a bad moment, played bishop b1, and I think you can imagine what black played, right? There is a very strong double threat here, of course. Knight g4, that's what followed in the game. We have a double threat of queen takes h2 mate and knight f2 with a fork, so there is no way white can defend here. Obviously, if they put the queen on g3, we could just trade on g3 and then give check anyway on f2. So in the game, I think they gave check on a3, and black just went back with the king, and here white resigned. So This was, of course, a very unfortunate course of action for white, but this doesn't really speak against the logic of this example. If we go back to the very beginning, this was about freeing some space for our king, making space for the king. How should that be done? Well, with the rook, it's the only way we can do it, and we should put it on c8 so that our rook is active. And as we saw also, we are preventing the check on c5. So rook c8, this would be a good move for black, making space for the king after queen takes h7, king f8. The king is ready to move on to a safer place, in this case e7. So a simple case, but very useful. Let's continue. Let's have a look at a different case with the white pieces this time, and on the queen side in this game with the white pieces T-style and playing black Erstmo. Black has just played a move rook takes e4. They have sacrificed the rook on e4, and actually there are also two pieces down here, so safe to say black is playing for an attack here. You can see that after this move rook takes e4, there is the concrete threat of mate in 1 with queen b2. So what do you think? How should white how should I deal with this threat? How to defend against the threat of mate in 1? Not so simple, right? Not so simple. You can see that also, by the way, white has some of their own mating ideas like queen d8, but for that to happen, of course, the queen has to be deflected somehow. But right now, our priority is to save our skin, and what we will have to do here, if we consider that not only queen b2 is threatened, but also perhaps queen e6, after which, again, white king would be in big trouble, it's time to give the king a chance to move to a better square. We have to free a square for the king. That has to be done with the rook again. So this time we have to do it in this way, right? You got it. Rook a b1, we defend against the mate, and we make sure that if they check us, we can play king a1. They don't have time to take, for example, on e2, because as we were discussing, there is the idea of queen d8, which wouldn't mate, but it would trade off the queens, which means that white would have an extra piece here after queen e8 and take and so on. So this doesn't really work for black. After king a1, they will have to play instead queen f6, repeating moves, and we will also have to repeat, and the game would be a draw. Unfortunately, in the game, T-style reacted in a different way. He played in the game rook takes g7, opting for a counterattack, but after king takes g7, rook g1, black simply played here king h8. It was difficult for white to come to grips with black's attack. They tried in the game bishop c1, protecting the delicate b2 square. However, after queen e6, king a1, black found a very nice move here. What do you think black played at this point? That's right, there is a concrete threat of queen d8, so we should be a little careful here. White also has a checking option on b2, which explains why we should, before taking the bishop, we should give another check so that we can take on e2 with check like that. So that's what happened in the game. White resigned here after queen e5 check, useful intermediate check in the attack. So what we have seen here is that white was under big pressure. There was the threat of mate in 1 with queen b2, and there was also the idea of queen e6. The only way to deal with these two threats at the same time would be rook a b1, because in this way, not only do we control the square on b2, but we also provide the king with a right square, with escape square on a1, and it's enough on this occasion for white to keep on fighting here, because they have two extra pieces, and also there is the threat of mate, so black would have to settle for the draw here. So very important move, rook b1 here, rook a b1, to free the a1 square. All right, let's take a more complex example. This time definitely things will become a little more complex here for black. You can see that white has sacrificed a whole piece in this vibrating battle between with the white pieces Parawa and playing black Gazarian. White is about to mate black. You can see that there is the concrete threat of queen g8 followed by queen takes f7. So what do you think? What could we do about that? Which would be the best way to counter white's attack? Sorry, not so simple, right? Not so simple. In normal situations, we would be able to cover the square on g8, but that's not possible here. We are missing some defensive piece. We would love to have a queen on, let's say, g6, but that's not going to happen here. We have to figure out another way of saving our king. Yeah, moving the king doesn't make sense because they would check us anyway. So the answer resides in providing the king with an additional escape square. How can that be done? That's right, we have to play here rook e8. In this way, the king will be able to move on to d8, and as you can see, obviously, the queen side is a much safer place for the king in this case. So it looks, at first sight, I would say, slightly counterintuitive to play this move, because supposedly we are now obstructing the king, but it's not actually correct because we are providing him with a very important square on d8. Please notice that this check on e2 is not making sense, because white would just move the king and then there would still be this issue with the mate, and additionally black's queen would be exposed. So very important move here, rook e8. Let's have a look at what happened in the game. White didn't want to enter this situation, of course. They understood that this would play against them, the attack would be over, and it's annoying that black is offering the trade of queens. So they played instead here bishop takes b7. Now we have to be careful, because if we take on b7, you can see the problem, right? You're right. In that case, we run into a skewer here. White would then play queen g8 and take on f7 and finally pick up the queen on b7. So let's not play that. That's a nice thing, that when you're a piece up, that you can sometimes consider giving back something. We don't have to take back. This is the non-recapture that we talked about previously. Rook ab8 is what Ghazaryan played here. Very clever move. And now actually there is a lot of pressure on white, because you can also see that this rook was hanging from the very beginning, and in the long run there is a passed pawn on the b file. So safe to say the pressure is on white now. They found a way to secure a draw here. They played rook takes d4. They could also play, I think, queen g8 and take a draw in this way, right? This they had all the time probably, but they're trying their last chances here, see if they can confuse black. They played here rook takes d4. So now again, if we are not careful, if we take with a queen here, you can see that this would invite white to carry out queen g8, king e7, queen takes f7, king d8, and they will have the very nasty move here. You got it, bishop c6. Very unpleasant, because that is the threat of queen takes e8. Black cannot defend it in a good way, and obviously if rook e7, white would play here, I think, queen f8. Is that so? I thought they would have something even stronger, but yeah, this is probably strong enough, right? They can then take and take, and yeah, black would be in big trouble here. So this didn't happen because Ghazaryan was more careful. He played here simply c takes d4, so that the queen stays close to the f7 pawn. And at this point, white already noticed that it's time to bail out. They played queen g8 check, and after king e7, queen g5. Again, if they take, we just escape to d8 as usual, no, with credit to black's first move in this example. So queen g5 check was played in the game, king f8, and the players repeated here, queen g8, king e7, and queen g5. They agreed to a draw here. So nice example, I would say, at least if you ask me. This move, rook d8 to e8, it's not intuitive, but it saved black's skin here. We have to understand what white is after. Again, we're back in chapter 1, detecting the threat. We have to notice that this is coming up, and we have to provide a king with a safe square, and that square in this case is the square on, it's the square on d8. All right, let's have a look at a somewhat more quiet case. We have a game between, with the white pieces, Tabatabai, and playing black is Garibyan. You can see that white is having one or two pawns. One pawn, one extra pawn. And black actually just sacrificed a piece here. They played queen h5 to f5. They didn't want to trade queens having a minus pawn. They went all in here for an attack. So whenever your opponent sacrifices something, as we discussed earlier, the first instinct should be to check the acceptance of the sacrifice. So do you think we can get away with e takes f6? Or do you think that this would be a bad idea? What would be your way of seeing things here? Can white get away with it, or it would be too dangerous to take on f6? Maybe we should play something safer? I think you know what I'm aiming at here, right? If we play something safer, something like queen f3, for example, protecting the pawn on f4, black could try knight h5, and they still have some counterplay in exchange for the pawn. I was looking at this move here, knight e5, with multiple threats, but as you can imagine, in an attacking situation, black is happy to give away the exchange. They would play rook takes d5, and after queen takes d5, knight takes f4. Things would still be at least a bit unclear. The typical case of positions where computers will like white, they don't see any dangers, but the human is like, so, if I can avoid this, much better. So in the game, Tabatabai instead called the sacrifice. He took on f6 because he saw that after queen takes f4, he could free a square for the king. He could make space for his king in a very simple way. Of course, he played here simply bishop g2. I think this example is interesting because as opposed to the first examples in this chapter, here there is actually a second choice. We could play also the move f3. In this way, we would protect the pawn on h2, but you can see what will happen in that case, right? Aha, black will bring a new player to the battle here. Rook d2 would be devastating with the pawn falling on h2. So that's the pitfall that white has to avoid. Definitely, on this occasion, it makes sense to free this square for the king. Bishop g2. Now if queen takes h2, king f1, white has no problems. This is what I call the dragon bishop. When you have this fianchetto bishop on the king side, it can resist many attacks. It's like the king's best friend, you could say. In the game, Garibian instead played rook d2, and white didn't lose their head in the complications. They simply played here queen f3, protecting and offering the exchange of queens. The game is not that interesting anymore after queen takes h2, king f1. Black simply doesn't have enough pieces to attack. This bishop is really a giant in the defense. There followed bishop b6, and I think there was different ways in which white could react. Rook e2 perhaps one option, but knight e4 is much nicer because also now white is playing for an attack. We win a tempo by hitting the rook. After rook takes b2, f takes g7, you can see that there are ideas such as knight f6 coming up. Black played in the game rook d8, and white simply played rook ad1, offering the exchange of rooks, having an extra piece, and also actually white is playing for an attack here. Yeah, completely winning with an extra piece. Black had already resigned, it seems, on the previous move after f takes g7. That's perfectly understandable because their attack backfired completely. So what happened here is that, sorry, white, they were brave enough to accept the sacrifice e takes f6 because they had noticed that here they could simply make space for their king by means of bishop g2. There were no dangers for the king anymore once it reached f1, and it was helped by the assistance of the dragon bishop, so to speak. All right, let's continue. Our next example is slightly more difficult, I would say. We're talking about the king in the center, which sometimes happens in some openings. We don't castle very quickly, depending on the opening variation that we are playing. Look at this position, please. What's going on here? You can see that white is about to get mated, right? Black has just played knight e4 with a very devastating threat, of course, that any chess player knows about. You got it, queen f2. So not so simple for white, right? Not so simple. They have at this point, I think, 2 extra pawns, but their king is in real danger. Not only queen f2 is threatened, but also there is the threat of knight takes c3 with material gains for black. So what do you think? How should we deal with this threat? Which would be the smartest way to help our king here? Definitely several moves that we could consider here. Maybe the first move which might cross your mind is to put the rook on f1 so that we don't get mated and we can live with the other situation with the loss of the exchange, but still after knight takes e3, b takes e3, bishop takes e3, bishop d2. I mean, this kind of sacrifice is very common. We give away the exchange, bishop takes a1, queen takes a1, and we have some compensation. But I would maybe believe in this if I had a king on h1, for example. But if I still have it in the center, I'm not fully convinced. In the Grunfeld, I remember there are some lines where you do this. You sack the exchange and you have a nice diagonal for your queen and for your bishop and so on. But here we have the king in the center. That doesn't happen in my Grunfeld line. So after, let's say, bishop e7, white would probably not be completely safe in this position. We can also see that their center can be attacked by black's pieces here. So not so clear. What else could we play here? Maybe you thought about the move queen d4. In this way, we are obstructing black's queen along the g1, a7 diagonal. But as you can see, now black will take on c3 with even bigger dividends. They can take on c3 like that after queen takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes e3, and now white is collapsing here. So this should, of course, be avoided. I think that by now you already know which is the best move. But it's again a little about not seeing ghosts. Nobody died because the opponent's queen reached f2, right? That's the right mindset here. in this game between Moisenko with white and Kutukidis with the black pieces, Moisenko played queen c2. Very clever move. In this way, we safeguard the knight on c3, and more importantly, we provide a square for our king on d1. Black could take on c3 first, or they could give the check. If they start with queen f2, they have a problem here, because after king d1, bishop takes c3. What do you think white would take? Would they take the bishop, or would they take the knight? Aha, this is 100% tactics. You could say, of course, we take the knight, because in this case, we have actually managed to trap black's bishop in an unexpected way. That's not a typical square where we trap a bishop, but it actually happened here. And also you can see that white's pawns are actually very useful for shielding their pieces here, both the king and the queen. So that's not a good idea for black. In the game, Kutukidis instead took first on c3, thereby limiting white's choice. After b takes c3, then he played queen f2 check. After king d1, black somehow needs to make their attack work. The knight is hanging at this point on e4. They tried here knight dc5, very natural move, bringing more pieces to the attack and preparing to go bishop f5. There were different options here for white at this point. I like very much the practical approach chosen by the Ukrainian grandmaster in this game, because I think if you ask the computer, it will tell you that bishop c4 is a good move here. This is, by the way, an interesting case about human thinking versus computer thinking. I think the first move it was saying was bishop c4. However, if you play this move, you will have to understand what to play against bishop f5. Black has no reason to take on c2. They should rather wait for white to trade queens. Bishop f5. So if you play bishop c4, you should now understand that white can simply take on f2, lose a rook after knight takes f2, put the king on e2 after knight takes h1, black has a whole rook up. However, white has bishop a3, and later on they can take the knight on h1, and white will be better in this endgame. But I would say, honestly, this is not completely evident when you sit there at the board and you're not able to move the pieces as here. So that's the engine line, but what Moisenko played is, in my opinion, more practical, but okay, I leave it to you. You can check what he played here and you will make your own conclusion about it. He played rook f1. This move helps to kick away black's queen, so that after queen takes g2, we can play bishop e3. Now all white's pieces are playing, and you can see that the bishop is possibly heading for d4 later on. Well, another merit of this move is that the king can slowly look for a safer haven on b2. In the game, black played bishop g4, bringing more pieces to the action. White played bishop d4, nice move, keeping things under control. Please notice that white doesn't hurry with rook g1, because after queen h3 there will be some pressure on the knight on f3, so we can keep that move in the pocket, the move rook g1 I mean. So white played bishop d4, and after rook ac8, we have a nice prophylactic move here by white. They noticed that this pawn might be hanging on some occasion. Definitely don't think about taking pawns like that. At this point, we are interested in safeguarding our position. So for that reason, white played here rook a3. Very nice prophylactic thinking, overprotecting the pawn on c3. And now we're getting ready for our king maneuver to b2. So that's what happened in the game. White was better, even if it's a chaotic position. White seems to have a nicer position here, because they are still a pawn up, right? Yeah, they're a pawn up, and they have the bishop pair, and these pawns are ready to run forward. So yeah, that's what happened in this game. I thought this was an interesting example from the opening. As you can see in this case, the Nimzo Indian, white seemed to be in some kind of trouble, but yeah, black's attack was not that devastating. White kept a cool head here, and they played this move queen c2. Very nice to play king d1. Modern chess, you could say. Okay, let's continue. Let's have a look at another example. We will now talk a little about how we can use our pawns when making space for our king. So far we have seen, I think, bishops and knights. Here we saw the queen making space. Else, of course, is the rook, which very often makes space for the king because it's next to the king and so on. In this next example, we're talking about the pawns. This is a completely different situation. You can see that we're already in some kind of early endgame or late middle game. Black has a far advanced passed pawn on b2, which is of course our main enemy here. That's a very dangerous pawn. On the other hand, white's a pawn up, and you could say that the bishop also outglances the knight in this case. This is a very nice bishop. So let's see if we can understand this position. It's a game between Yotov with white and Dražić playing black. Perhaps the first move that catches our attention would be queen c7, attacking the rook and the knight. However, as you can see here, this would be a complete disaster. It's a blunder. What do you think black would play? Okay, I don't have to ask you twice. Of course, rook c8 and rook c1 is coming next. Please notice that the function of rook c1 giving mate, we are not exactly winning the rook because it's protected by the bishop, but it's mate which comes up here, which means that white should think about their king in the first place, what to do with the king. So here on this occasion, since there is this imminent threat of rook c8 and rook c1, we should make space for the king, and that can be done by our pawns. It's actually something that we learn very early in our chess playing career. As beginners, we are taught to make a move like h3 or g3, occasionally f3 perhaps. Sometimes the pawn can even go 2 steps, especially if we're in the endgame. It's nice to play like h4 instead of h3 because we gain some extra space. So at this moment, what do you think? Should white go g3 or should I go h3? Which one do you think would be most suitable? All right, h3 is possible, but in a general context, it's often making more sense to use the pawn which frees a square which cannot be attacked by the opponent's bishop or which we control with our bishop. So since we are having here the light square bishop, it makes a lot of sense to play g3 so that we can put the king on g2. If you instead prefer to play h3, this would be a great option if we had the other bishop. Imagine a bishop on f4, for example. You can play it here also. I noticed one variation where this would actually play against white. What black could play here is this funny looking move, prophylactic move, king f8. Black's point with this move is that they are avoiding mating ideas themselves. The knight is protected. If we now continue with our plan here, let's say we would like to trade queens, playing the move queen d4. We could play it, but it wasn't so good to play it last turn because we would not have the square for the king. Anyway, if we play it now, we would like to trade queens, but black could then give check on c1, and after king h2, they could play queen c7. This would be favorable for black to have the queen at home, and later on they could try to cook up some counterplay with f5 maybe. Not completely clear, probably white is better here, but if we can avoid this, it's much better, of course. So if we instead now, if you now compare these two options, if we play g3 instead, you can see that if black goes king f8, we could play queen d4 here, and now it's not the same thing. After queen c1, we go king g2, and now black can't go back with the queen because in that case the pawn is hanging. So this would be less suitable for black than the other case, so because our king cannot be attacked. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is simply that whenever you're about to make space for your king with your pawns, check the color of the bishops, please. Both your own bishop and the opponent's bishop. If they have a bishop, if they have a dark square bishop here, for example, it's of course better to play g3. If you have a light square bishop, it's also usually better to play g3 because your king will be shielded by that bishop later on. And don't forget that if you're in the endgame, then very often it's actually better to go 2 steps when you're freeing space for your king. Anyway, talking a lot, let's have a look at the game. g3 was played by Yotov in the game, and Dražić replied with g6. He's also freeing space for his king, but now this allows white to go for a strong attack here. Queen c7. As you can see, there is no real good way of safeguarding these two pieces. Black played rook e8. I think when they played g6, black noticed the move queen c7. What they didn't notice was white's next move here in the game. So I invite you to look for white's most powerful move here. Hint, try to eliminate our worst enemy. I'm referring to the pawn on b2. That's right. There can probably be many moves here, but I like very much white's practical choice in this game. They played here queen c2, minimizing risk. As you can see, if queen takes c2, we will take with the bishop, then we will, if they protect it, I mean something like that, we will play bishop b3 and we'll take the pawn. So in the game, black tried queen b4 instead, and now of course white just took the pawn. Rook takes b2, queen e1, check, king g2, and white had 2 extra pawns and they went on to win. So this was not a good choice what black played here. With hindsight, the move g6 was not correct. They should have played this move that we talked about, king f8, a prophylactic move, so that queen c7 doesn't hit the knight. But still, white will be okay here. Yeah, queen c7 again is a bad idea because there is rook c1 coming up, but as we discussed after king f8, white could go for the trade of queens instead. And as you can see here, queen takes d4, e takes d4. We have to be careful, of course, avoid the knight's arrival to c3 and things like that. But we could probably slowly bring in our king, and there should be good chances of winning this endgame with the white pieces. All right, let's continue. Our last example, it features the same idea of clearing space for our king using a pawn, but in a completely different context. This is a very simple example with comparison with our next example. In this game between Minko with the white pieces and Adhiban playing black. Let's see if you and me we can understand this crazy position. Let's see what's going on. First thing, material. White is slightly ahead in material. They have an extra piece, but okay, this knight, as for now, it's far away from the action. Secondly, black is about to queen. That would, of course, change everything in this position. But third, there is an attack confronted by black here. Black's king is very weak. You can see that there is the concrete threat of queen f8 and queen h8. So very, very tricky position. You can see that it's not simple to find a solution for black here. In the game, Adhiban played rook h8, hoping to trade off the rooks, which would make life a little more quiet for the king, and then later the queen could help the pawn to queen. However, what Minko played here was a very good move. He played here rook d1, so that the pawn cannot advance. He keeps the rooks on the board for the sake of counterplay. So this was difficult for black to find a way to win this game. They played rook h1, and I think they just repeated here, right? Yeah, they just repeated. Sorry, rook d8, and did he try king h7? Yeah, he tried king h7 also, but then white played rook f8. As you can see now, we have to do something about this threat, king d7, and white wisely came back with the rook, and the game was a draw. But black could have gone for more here. Black could have gone for more if we use our involved idea here, making space. Yeah, by now you know which is the right move. Of course, the move g5 here will help black to escape the checks, opening up a path for the king towards the king side. I'm convinced that Adhiban saw this move in the game. Yeah, he would see, even in a bullet game, he would see this game. But he was scared about something here, and I think I know what. So let's have a look. If white plays here queen e8, we can just play king g6. And yeah, this doesn't make so much sense for white because the king will come here anyway. I looked at this funny move so that we would give perpetual here, but black could play the move rook h6. Yeah, it's confusing that black and queen the whole time, but they never do it. Another funny detail is that sometimes black can actually play something like this and try to queen like that and take the rook. But I think in this case white could play something like king b3, and sometimes the knight can help the king if checked from the queen and so on. Yeah, crazy position. One thing to notice here is that actually if you have a knight next to the king, it's a very nice protection. Now it's difficult for black to get at white's king here. So I don't know, maybe this is also winning for black, but it looks dangerous, no? This check and so on. We cannot go this way, perhaps due to that. Yeah, I wouldn't like to be in black's shoes here. So after rook d4, black has a nice retreating move here. Can you find a retreating move which makes life a little more calm for black's king? Aha, we can play here the move rook h6. This is very clever, so that if queen check, we can go to h5 with the king. So let's go back to our position here after g5. Black plays g5, freeing a path for the king towards the king side, or towards white's side of the board, so to speak. White's most critical move is queen f8, and after king g6, at this point, rook d6. I think he was simply not convinced that this would work for black, this situation. But after king h5, you can see that black's king is ready to move over to the king side, to the white part of the board. We have some squares here which apparently can't easily be attacked by white's pieces. As I was saying, their knight is very far away. So let's continue. Let's make a few more moves. Queen h6, check, king g4, rook d4, and yeah, you can picture where that king should go. Exactly, king f3. We could also go to g3 possibly. And it appears as if white is actually in huge trouble here because they can't really get at black's king. You can see that the queen is very well placed on f5, where it's avoiding the checks from different angles. So yeah, crazy example. You can definitely not blame Adhiban for not playing like this. This was, by the way, move 34 in the game, and I know from this game that it was extremely complex, so they probably didn't have a lot of time left at this moment. But yeah, I wanted to share this interesting example with you. I think it's important to notice this kind of idea. g5, in this case, freeing a square for the king on g6, and later on being able to move the king forward. We will come back to this kind of scenario, by the way, in the chapter about the brave king. We will see several examples like this at that moment. All right, let's have a quick look at what we have checked in this chapter. We started with this example, like a typical example where the threat of mate was a problem here for black, but they found a nice way of solving it. Rook c8, bringing the king to e7 without fearing the queen's arrival at h7. We saw the less typical example in this game with Tisdal Ostmo, where you can see that white's king was in danger, but by playing rook b1, they would free the square on a1 for their king, which would mean at least a draw. Under these circumstances, rook b1, freeing the a1 square for the king in the event of queen e6, we would be ready to play king a1. We saw the game between Parawa and Gazarian, where black was haunted by this threat, queen g8 and queen takes f7, so they hurried to play rook e8, thereby creating a path for their king towards the queen side. We had a look at this example where black was attacking white. They had a piece less, but white correctly played bishop g2, freeing a square for the king on f1. In this very interesting example, Moisenko hurried to play queen c2, very cold-blooded move, because he saw that in this way, after queen f2, he would be able to play king d1, and the king would be relatively safe in the center. We saw also in the game Yotov versus Drazic that white was about to give some space for their king, some fresh air for the king. We talked about which would be the best pawn to use, and I told you that we should check the color of the bishop on the board. For that reason, g3, very clever move. We get ready to play king g2, and we don't have to worry about moves like rook c8 anymore. We could put our queen. Yeah, where would we put our queen? Here maybe, right? This looks like a good square. So this is perhaps what we were talking about before. The problem for white is not so much that the rook is attacked. The problem was the mate. But now we're ready to play king g2, and it's actually white who is threatening to give mate. So this is a typical, you could say almost a beginner's advice to give some air for your king. And on this occasion, it seems ideal to use the g-pawn for that purpose. And last example, crazy example where black could have played this move g5. Against all odds, they would be able to avoid white's strong attack and bring their king to safety along the light squares. All right, thanks a lot, and see you in the next chapter.